Greetings and welcome back. In the last mini lecture, I ended with talking about how the single member plurality system really reinforces two-party dominance and how third parties really get squeezed, how they don't tend to get much representation. But I didn't say that there is an exception. And the exception is that you can get a very small percentage of the vote nationwide. But if you're really, really popular in a very localized location, then you can get a fair number of seats. And so if you look, for example, at just the last two elections in Britain, so if you look up at your 11 elections that I've posted in your notes, the SNP is the Scottish Nationalist Party. Obviously, if you take a look at their vote total, it's not very impressive. In 2017, they got 3% of the vote. In 2019, which was the last election, I'm rounding up to 4%. You can see it's 3.9%. But this is a party that routinely nationwide gets 3 or 4% of the vote. But they get quite a few seats. And the reason they get quite a few seats is because even though they're not popular very many places, they're really popular in a few places. And the one place the Scottish nationalists are popular is in Scotland. In fact, that's really the only place they run candidates. And as you can see, in 2017, they got 35 seats. In 2019, they got 48 seats. I mean, just compare that to the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats got a lot more votes, right? In 2017, they got 7.4%. They got more than twice the votes of the Scottish Nationalists, and yet they only got 12 seats. And then 11.6%. In other words, they got triple the votes of the Scottish Nationalists, and yet they only got 11 seats because, like Ross Perot in the example that I gave you in the previous mini lecture, Perot was popular in all 50 states, but he was not the most popular anywhere. And that's the problem with the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats are a popular party. A lot of people vote for them, but they finish second a lot. In seats that the conservatives win, they often finish second or third, but they draw well. And in seats that Labor wins, they draw well. So they're kind of the alternative, uh, kind of more moderate people who think the conservatives are too conservative. Labor is too right. Labor's too liberal. Conservatives are too conservative. More moderate voters often vote liberal Democratic, but they're not the most popular. And so the liberal Democrats for me are the Ross Perot of Great Britain, to use that analogy. Um, Now, I want to make a few observations, and when you see these elections, don't let these numbers scare you. I'm not going to ask you any of these specific numbers, but I want you to look at these numbers to look for some general trends that I may test you on. For example, one of the things that should stand out is that typically in Britain, the winning party has a plurality of the vote, that is less than 50%, but more than anyone else. But they get a majority of the seats. So if you take a look at 1979, I'm just going to scroll through a few of these elections real quick. There's kind of a formula, and this goes back before the 70s. This goes back to the 60s, even to the 50s. There hasn't been a political party that has received a majority of the vote since 1935. So the winning party has received a plurality. So in 1979, the conservatives received 44.9%. I'll round it up to 45. In 1983, the conservatives won with 42%. In 87, they won with 42%. Right? In 92, they won with 43%. Again, I'm rounding up. But you see, there was a formula for many years in Britain. get 42, 43, 44% of the vote, and you'll win a majority, more than half of the seats in the Commons. So in 1997, they won 359. In 1983, 397. In 87, 376. In 92, 336. So in all of those elections, the winning party received a plurality of the popular vote and a majority of the seats. And I think there is a question on the exam that says, in a typical election, what happens in Britain? And that's it. Plurality of the popular vote, majority of the seats. You can also see that trend that I talked about, the liberal Democrats. Those poor guys are vastly underrepresented in election after election after election, right? In 1979, they got 14% of the vote, high number, only 9 seats. In 1983, they got almost as many votes. Take a look at 1983. Take a look. In 1983, Labor only got 27.6% of the vote, and they got 209 seats. The Liberal Democrats got almost as many votes, 25.4%, and yet look, they only got 23 seats. So when we talk about the single member plurality system really working to the benefit of the big two, and you're wondering, why don't we have third-party challengers in the United States? This is why. Third-party challengers, the great difficulty is it's not enough to be popular. The liberal Democrats are popular. Look at those percentages. 14%, 25%, 23%, 18%, right? They're popular in election after election, and yet, because it is a winner-take-all system, they don't win many seats. So, all right, typical election, plurality of the vote, majority of the seats, and the big third-party candidate gets discriminated against because the single-member plurality district works against third parties being meaningful challengers. Okay, so those are the first two big things that stand out when I look at that data. But then something else. Take a look at 2 of the last 4 elections. In 2 of the last 4 elections, that hasn't happened. If you take a look at 2010, okay, the conservatives got a plurality of the vote, but notice it was only 36% of the vote. The old formula of 42, 43, 45, 45 didn't work. The winning party only got 36% of the vote. And the result was they only got 306 seats. They needed 326 to have a majority, so they were 20 seats short. So Mr. Cameron, who was the conservative leader in 2010, reached out to the liberal Democrats, who had 57 seats, and they formed a coalition government. So the conservatives formed a coalition with the liberal Democrats. The liberal Democratic leader, Mr. Clegg, became, if you will, the deputy prime minister, the number 2 guy. So the liberal Democrats were part of the government, and that's kind of the problem. Because as a third party, it was always good to be able to blame the government in power, but now, if people aren't happy, and Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg didn't get along that well, and if you take a look at the 2015 election, look what happened to the liberal Democrats. They went from 23% of the vote to less than 8. They went from 57 seats down to 8. And in 2015, Mr. Cameron was able to win a very thin majority. Once again, only 36.9% of the popular vote, not that magic 42 to 44, but did have a majority of the seats. Remember, a majority is 326. And He gets 330, so razor thin. So Mr. Cameron puts out a referendum on Brexit. And Mr. Cameron lost the referendum and resigned in 2016. Theresa May takes over, and Theresa May should have just waited till 2020. She had 4 years where she didn't have to face the electorate, but she believed that if she called for elections early, the conservative vote margin would increase. And she was right. Take a look at 2017. The conservatives, instead of getting 36.9% of the vote, got 42.4%, which in the old days, remember, that's what you wanted. 42, 43, 44% of the vote, and you were going to win. But in 2017, remember, she needed 326 seats to form a government. She only had 317. Now, what's interesting is the Liberal Democrats felt that the conservatives had lied to them. And before that election, the Liberal Democrats said, "We will not form a government with you." So Theresa May couldn't reach out to the Liberal Democrats like Cameron did in 2010. So I don't have the party listed, but a party with 0.9% of the vote, 0.9%, the Democratic Unionist Party, a party that only had 10 seats in Northern Ireland, formed a government with the Conservatives if Theresa May and the Conservatives would pledge to send an extra £1 billion. That would be about $1.2 billion for projects in Northern Ireland. So that was the price of forming a government, was £1 billion. And she did. And then, of course, the European elections went bad for the Conservatives. May was under a lot of pressure. A lot of people were mad at her for giving up a majority government and stuck in a coalition. And so she resigned. And so the current prime minister, if I ask you on the exam, is Boris Johnson. And as you can see in 2019, it kind of looks like business as usual. 43.6% of the vote, plurality of the vote, more votes than anyone else, and take a look at the seats. 365, a healthy majority, a 40-seat margin. Labor got wiped out in 2019. That 32%, very low, 202 seats, the lowest, I believe, since 1935. They got absolutely obliterated. Interestingly, the Liberal Democrats picked up quite a bit of votes. It went from 7 to 11%, but notice that they actually lost a seat, which is interesting. And to me, what's intriguing is that regional parties thrive in Britain. I already mentioned that, I have the Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrats, and Social, the Scottish Nationalists listed in your notes, but in reality, there are 8 political parties represented in the Commons right now. So I put a lot of data, a lot of numbers. Once again, don't need to know them. You should know typical elections, plurality of the vote, majority of the seats. The single-member plurality system discriminates against third parties unless those parties are highly concentrated, like a nationalist party. So the Scottish nationalists do well. The Welsh nationalists do well. The Irish nationalists do well. But a national third party is going to get killed in a single-member plurality system. In the next mini lecture, we'll look at other themes from your notes in the data that I didn't mention.